Hello to everyone. I think we are set to go. Hello, my name is Felipe Carazo from the Tropical Forest Alliance at the World Economic Forum. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar on navigating landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, the first steps for company engagement. So would it be morning, afternoon, or night where you are? We're really happy to have you here, and we look forward for you to learn more about these efforts of corporate engagement in trying to address deforestation all across the supply chains. This webinar is a collaboration between the Tropical Forest Alliance and SourceUp. And before I start, just some basic housekeeping rules. One, please do share your questions in the questions and answers function of the Zoom application. There will be space for these questions to be part of the panel discussion. And of course, we might have to be selective on it, but we try to read the atmosphere in terms of your queries and doubts, and try to also use the instruments about the Jurisdictional Action Network to address those questions systematically. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to the Jurisdictional Action Resource Hub with other resources in due course. So hopefully you can revert to this or recommend the webinar if valuable. And of course, if you have any technical issues, please do feel free to contact our team. We have Jack Lloyd online. You'll see his email and back in the slide, down in the slide, and you can reach out to him for a technical issue or even for further information as we move forward. As I mentioned, the webinar aims to provide a guide for companies by building upon companies' experiences and lessons learned that our panelists will share. Would be for large and small companies, actually those that are really seeking to understand how to engage effectively in the landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, and how to make the business models that they run a source of added value within the upstream of supply chains. And I'm happy to say that in addition to the content that we're going to try to address through the webinar, this webinar serves a very special occasion. It marks the official transition of the Jurisdictional Action Network, which is a fantastic tool, and it will be transitioned into the new house, which is basically the SourceUp platform, right? SourceUp is a top-notch platform that allows, facilitates engagement of stakeholders in driving action on the ground. And you'll learn more about that as we go. But we want to celebrate that we're basically reinforcing these instruments in a win-win scenario. With that said, please let me introduce the panelists that we have with us today here. First, I want to introduce Claire Prescott, who is the head of Sustainable Places at CDP. Claire is going to be accompanied by Joseph James, Joe, who is a leader in thought process regarding landscape and jurisdictional efforts. And he does that aside from his day-to-day efforts as sustainability manager at Sainsbury. And then, of course, Annelot Krena de Jong. Please, Annelot, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, but Annelot is the head of development of SourceUp, and she's spearheading this valuable initiative that I mentioned. So with that said, let me hand it over to Claire so she can kick off the webinar with her presentation. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you for the introduction, Felipe. We are very happy to be here. CDP has supported the Jurisdictional Action Network and Resource Hub for many years now, and we think it's a great resource for our wider practitioner community. So I'm going to briefly present today on the trends over the years in adoption of landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, then looking at how we've started to assess and understand the potential credibility of those initiatives disclosed to us, and then also looking at some of the typical types of roles and type of engagement that companies are taking in these initiatives. Finally, a bit of reflection on what's driving this adoption. So you'll see the graph on the left. CDP introduced the landscape and jurisdictional approach questions into our corporate and states and regions questionnaires in 2020. And we've seen the number of adopters grow significantly over that time, and the corporate disclosure has grown tenfold in that time. So even just looking from last year to this year, so we're always 1 year behind with our data. Wider explanation for that can be found in our wider materials. But essentially, looking at the numbers for 2023, we had 235 companies globally disclose 309 engagements in landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, and that related to almost 300 unique landscape initiatives. And then the 2024 data, we saw a significant increase, both in number of companies, but also in number of engagements. So 317 companies disclosed 574 engagements, and that was in 309 unique landscape initiatives. So that demonstrates as well that we've seen a significant increase in engagement in multiple landscape initiatives, which we think is a great trajectory that we're on. To caveat that the analysis is still ongoing for the 2024 data, we do various things to assess the credibility of the disclosure and validate it. So first and foremost, we look to see if the disclosure meets the core criteria of landscape initiatives. We'll come on to that next. But then we also validate some of the new initiatives being disclosed with the wider landscape practitioner community. So that's ongoing. We expect to have the findings from that by around November time. But to say that historically, we've generally found that around 50% of disclosed initiatives have been considered credible, and others could be considered to be on the pathway to that, or varying degrees of that. Some, nascent initiatives being disclosed in there. Next slide, please, Jack. So here we can see the 4 criteria of a mature landscape initiative. So we found over the years that with this increasing interest and engagement in landscape initiatives, that we found it necessary to kind of convene stakeholders to have a simple and consistent understanding of the core criteria, core elements of a mature landscape initiative. Many of the leading landscape practitioner organizations in this space then came together to agree on the core criteria and accompanying sub-criteria. We're just presenting the core criteria here. The criteria essentially present a roadmap for new and existing landscape initiatives to improve their effectiveness, and a means by which to assess the maturity of these initiatives for different purposes or use cases. We'll put the link in the chat so you can see the sub-criteria and more information. But essentially, while landscape initiatives will take different pathways, as we know they all look and are different, to build out these criteria and sub-criteria over time, we believe collectively that mature initiatives that have these criteria in place are more likely to be more resilient, more attractive to investors, and better placed to deliver more durable sustainability impacts in the landscape. So mature landscape initiatives are characterized by the 4 criteria presented, integral to their effectiveness. These core criteria and accompanying sub-criteria can act as a roadmap for developing the initiatives to align over time. And the implementation of the 4 core criteria can also act as safeguards, minimizing various risks associated with decision-making processes and actions in the landscape, and enhancing positive social and environmental outcomes. So the first all-encompassing criteria is the scale of the initiative. So we believe that the landscape initiative should operate at a scale, losing my volume, should operate at a scale of a defined ecological, socio-economic or administrative area. And then that there should be multi-stakeholder governance processes or platform, collective goals and actions, and collective monitoring. Next slide, please, Jack. So to look at some of the trends that we're seeing in the 2024 disclosure, of those 574 engagements reported, we've categorized the company responses to their perceived role in the landscape initiative, their overarching goals for engaging, and the types of actions that they're taking to support the initiative. So the trend for type of role is fairly consistent. We are still largely seeing companies operating in the funder or partner space. This accounted for more than 50%, around 60%, accounting for their role as funder, and similarly high percentage as partner. That's also to say that we're not counting to a total 100% here on the basis of there being multiple companies engaging in some initiatives and multiple companies taking differing roles in differing initiatives, but by and large the trend being that it's still primarily in that type of role. And the goals, again, similarly anticipated, primarily being to advance environmental objectives, but we are seeing some variation and change in time over the type of engagements identified as associated with those environmental goals. So we're seeing that increased variability in types of factors being considered. So still very much avoided deforestation objectives core there, but we're also seeing more identification of meeting the objective to meet goals related to biodiversity, water security, and oceans through the disclosure. And similarly, in the organization's actions, which are supporting the initiative, the green graph to the right, we can see that the action category is showing the most actions associated with supporting the participation in planning and multi-stakeholder alignment, followed by building community and multi-stakeholder capacities. So we, again, will publish more detail supporting exactly the type of activities that relate to each of these categories in the output that we will disseminate in November. And final slide, please, Jack. Thanks. Oh, there we go, got it. Yeah, just a note to the momentum that we're seeing growing. So over the past years, we're obviously seeing much change in this space and you know, as we've hoped for, this increased adoption of landscape and jurisdictional initiatives. We're seeing now from the science community that the emergence of things like the Earth Commission report on Earth system boundaries, it specifically as part of the biodiversity component highlights two interconnected systems, so natural landscapes and working landscapes, both with boundaries that reflect the need to address socio-ecological and economic needs at significant environmental scales. And then global standards and frameworks such as the UNFCCC and the CBD. So the CBD agreeing on the global biodiversity framework and the associated 23 targets. As specified by the convention, the ecosystem approach is the primary framework for action. But when looking at the ecosystem approach, we can see the reflection within that of the core elements of core pillars of best practice that we associate with landscape and jurisdictional approaches, and thus can see the potential for application there of the landscape and jurisdictional approach, inclusive of seascapes and watersheds, as a framework to implement the 23 targets of the global biodiversity framework. And we also acknowledge as well that many of the most advanced and mature landscape initiatives emerged as a result of climate change discussions, so related to subnational efforts to align agendas in priority locations that can halt or reverse emissions, nature loss and degradation, such as jurisdictional RED Plus programs, which we're seeing appear more frequently in disclosure as well. And finally, on the corporate side, we'd also highlight the following standards. So the science-based targets network, the SBTN, Science-Based Targets for Nature, the current methods for land and oceans, companies will be able to set targets to commit to or support engagement in landscape, seascape, or jurisdictional initiatives. And the TNFD framework is requesting companies to identify priority locations that are related with the operations in their value chain. This identification of priority locations, we believe, also advocates for taking action in places and with a relevant participation with local stakeholders as well, which we believe at scale suggests the best framework to support that would be landscape and jurisdictional initiatives. And similarly, for climate, landscapes and jurisdictional initiatives are recognised as beyond value chain measures, actions and implementation strategies for achieving Scope 3 emissions. So yeah, this is the alignment as we see it of the scientific, political and corporate agendas to advocate for the importance of collective action at landscape scale. So I will now pass over to Joe. Thanks.
Let me pick it up, Claire. Thanks a lot. I think that you've unveiled in a very short time, the deepness of this installed capacity that exists. This speaks to the level of will and commitment. This infrastructure in place, it should be considered as a positive signal that despite that the world changes, that we sometimes feel, cloud on top of us. There's entities, there's especially corporate stakeholders that think that this is good business. We're trying to do good business and we have to move forward. And with this capacity in place, there's no coming back. We have to really reinforce that. And so let me turn it over to Joe, who can really speak about good business within the framework that you've very well outlined, Claire, which is fantastic. So over to you, Joe.
Hi, and yeah, thanks for letting me come and talk to you. So for those of you, I recognize it's an international audience. For those of you who don't know, Sainsbury's are a supermarket. We're based in the UK. So we sell in kind of Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. And we have, alongside kind of all other major UK retailers, a commitment to be deforestation and conversion free by the end of 2025. But, that very much relates to kind of sourcing deforestation and conversion free products. We've got a 2020 cutoff date, and that's all kind of and that is super, super important in kind of providing a demand signal for the market to kind of really tackle deforestation and conversion in natural habitats. But we recognize that actually also, if you really want to tackle the root cause of deforestation and actually support resilient supply chains, you need to kind of go beyond sourcing, essentially. And that's where landscape initiatives come in, alongside kind of broader industry groups and advocacy with government. So I'm going to talk about the landscape initiatives side of that today, kind of how we go beyond sourcing and the kind of challenges and benefits that brings with us. So Sainsbury's is engaged in several landscape initiatives, two in Brazil, one in Indonesia on palm oil, and one in cocoa. We are engaged in these as part of the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition, and that's really been critical in bringing us on that journey, essentially, from and helping us understand, what investing in a landscape initiative means, the benefits it can bring, and also how to effectively collaborate with other people and other businesses in the supply chain to really achieve maximum impact. And I think it's been clear over the years that it does bring benefits to us. It brings benefits to companies from a reputational angle, which is helpful. But it also brings real benefits in building resilient supply chains in the face of increasing number and the severity of climate shocks. And I think that's what's really boosted the conversation around the landscape initiatives more recently in our business, is really how can these initiatives that we're investing in support long-term relationships with suppliers, with supply chains, to support resilience of supply chains, basically meaning that our customers can access and afford food going into the future for a long time in the future. And I think it's that's really opened up our relationship with the rest of the business and the interest in these initiatives with the rest of the business. That's a clear benefit, but I think there have been and there still are challenges in delivering that benefit. And I think the first bit is a real need to educate the business. And this, unfortunately, never ends. Every time you think you've landed the idea that landscape initiatives support resilient supply chains, you'll have someone come along and be like, well, can't I just work with my farmer directly and, shift my supply chains and do that and do that? And absolutely, you can never take those options off the table. But if you're truly serious about having long-term resilient supply chains and being able to kind of depend on those supply chains well into the future, and in the face of kind of like shocks where we don't know where the next one's coming from, we need to kind of continue that effort around education and really highlighting that, making that connection to resilience, and understand the importance of this at all levels of the business. And so that's the kind of first challenge. The second challenge, I think, is around working, and it relates to the first challenge. It was again about communication, but this time about communication with the landscape implementers. I think we are invested in some absolutely excellent landscape initiatives. Was I internally always able to communicate the excellent work they were doing on the ground in our reporting CDP internally to stakeholders? Not always. And I think sometimes there is a lack of the communication between implementers and funders is not always where it needs to be. And I think this is why SourceUp is such an important, helpful platform, actually, because it helps make that communication job so much easier. And I'm already kind of benefiting from that with my stakeholders, internal stakeholders. And I would say that there's just another benefit that I didn't realize it, but previously referenced by Claire, was the kind of benefits that these are being asked about in CDP, in TNFD. They do help your disclosure. I wouldn't discount that when you're able to. It just makes life, at the very least, it makes my life so much easier that I have something to say when people ask me these questions. But more broadly, I think when you're talking to investors and when you're talking to when you're receiving that kind of external scrutiny that kind of we receive as businesses, it's a really strong basis to show that you're actually serious about your deforestation and conversion commitment. It is not a tick box exercise for you. It is something serious. So that's my broad approach. That's the kind of broad benefits of it all. I had another question, which is around how companies consider how we strengthen our security of supply and cost efficiency, and how companies might start their own journey. And I guess I had kind of 4 kind of points that I made when in reflection of how Sainsbury's did this journey, which is the first step was really, how can you link investment in landscape initiatives to the wider goals of your colleagues? So the big thing, a bit of a shift in engagement we had internally was when we started to demonstrate and articulate how investment in landscape initiatives could allow for more affordable and accessible food in the long run for our customers. And that's where we really started to kind of talk the language of my colleagues and started to align with them in the purpose. We weren't asking for something additional extra that was kind of outside a kind of donation box. We were asking something that was actually fundamental to driving the kind of why they engage in our business and why they kind of get up in the morning. And that's been really, really helpful. Another bit is around looking at money. And I think money is always going to be tight for these kinds of things. And so a challenge that we did is actually having to look at where are we spending money in our budget that isn't having the desired impact. So there is nothing wrong with kind of reallocating budget. It's sometimes quite a hard conversation to have, but actually if you're struggling to find funds, which is such a common issue in companies, looking at where you're currently spending funds and asking if they having the desired impact in terms of tackling deforestation and conversion and achieving those broad environmental goals is a really good place to start. And I can give examples of that if people are interested. I think also really working on identifying opportunities for collaboration, resist the temptation to kind of do your own thing and go it alone. I know the reputational benefits seem kind of like really attractive at the time, but actually if you're truly serious about achieving impact and achieving resilience, you need to collaborate. And my final tip is that if there is any way to get senior people in your organization out to a landscape initiative, visiting those projects on the ground, that can really build enthusiasm in ways that is just impossible to do in a kind of meeting room, and can really help your case. It's a bit of a tough one. Can't always do it easily, but if the opportunity ever presents itself, I would recommend seizing it. So yeah, so those are kind of my tips basically for companies who are considering their own journey on landscape initiatives and what things we've been doing. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Joe. This is very constructive. As Claire outlined, the infrastructure that we have in place now. Joe, you are given a direct testament of what it means to lead. To have corporate leadership in this space, and of course you have to reinforce that belief that this is a good investment. You have to have that will. But you have to deal with a lot of nuance and probably uncertainties, and that requires also a lot of internal management. So what it entails is not easy, but it's important to have this knowledge not only get generated but shared, so that we can get more on board, as you outlined. And also you are referring to something that's very important as we try to have our vision in the horizon. Don't forget to having your boots on the ground, right? Get dirty, try to have a sense of what it means, right? What we are talking about here. Now, of course, as we have these ingredients, how do we scale up? How do we get those other businesses to engage? How do we create the enabling conditions for financial flows to allow us to really create that impact in the landscapes that we're trying to, where we want to move the needle and create good livelihoods and good productive systems? And I think this is where, to overcome those challenges, to try to educate the business, as you mentioned, Joe, we're trying to streamline efforts, tools, and opportunities ahead. And I think the SourceUp initiative is an example of that. But let me turn it over to Anelot, who can showcase how SourceUp is tackling these challenges of a scale up constructively and in a participatory mode. Over to you, Anelot.
Well, thank you, Felipe, and thank you. Great to do this webinar together. Yes, Jack is putting a few slides back online, because what I actually wanted to do is not just talk about SourceUp, but talk about a little bit more, because when we set up this webinar, our main aim is to help people in companies that are still exploring that potential opportunity of investing in landscape initiatives and engaging in landscape initiatives on their journey, right? What I wanted to start out with is, and I think that's also something that Joe already alluded to, right? It's not the easiest road, right? It can feel easier to just invest in a project, work with some direct suppliers, and go it alone. However, we also know that it can be a very rewarding journey to invest in landscape initiatives and engage with them. But we also know that throughout that process, regardless on whether you're still already exploring the opportunity and want to learn, what is a landscape initiative? Are there any landscape initiatives in my sourcing regions? Questions like that. Once you move over to, seriously considering it, speaking with your board, trying to convince them, inviting them to a trip to one of those landscape initiatives, or when you're actually onboarding and deciding on key performance indicators or managing an investment in a landscape initiative, and you're trying to get the right information out for your corporate reporting, a lot of questions arise. And luckily, and that's the main message that I want to share here, is there are some great resources and tools out there that can help you along that path. Next slide, please, Jack. And I want to present actually 4, so not just talk about SourceUp, but a few more that I would recommend for the people in this webinar that can really be helpful beyond, of course, what was already shared today, right? It's great to hear from Claire, and for me, the main message is there are already a lot of companies and a growing number of companies that are investing in landscape initiatives and that really see that as a valuable tool for implementing their sustainability strategy and achieving their goals. These are also more and more getting incorporated in important corporate reporting systems. So there's a good reason to do it, but then how to then take that step as a company that might not have already done that. The 4 that I want to share are, and I'll delve a little bit deeper in all 4 of them, are the Jurisdiction Action Network, and particularly the JA Resource Hub, ISEAL, SourceUp, and LandScale. And of course, there are many more great tools out there. The reason I selected these 4 are, first of all, because they are very highly focused on landscape initiatives specifically. They're also very well aligned. So these are all teams and organizations working very closely together. So they all bring a very uniform way of looking at landscape initiatives and of approaches that work really well. And last, but definitely not least, they are very much focused on the corporate audience. So they are really thinking about how can we help a company along this journey and what are the resources and tools that they need. So if you are in need of tools, insights, partners, connections, whatever, I can really recommend these 4, and I'll delve into each one of them. Next slide, please. So let's start with the Jurisdictional Action Network, and particularly the Jurisdictional Approaches Resource Hub. And I usually call it JA Resource Hub from now for short. So this is a website, and you can also see the web address at the bottom. That is part of Jurisdiction Action Network that I really recommend as a starting point. If you are still a bit unsure, what is the jurisdictional approach? What is a landscape initiative? How can we connect? This is really, and I can really say that Tropical Forest Alliance, they were really trailblazers when setting up this platform and visionary in understanding, okay, this is not something easy, and companies will really benefit from a good platform where they can find the right tools. So what can you find here? Things like a company roadmap that really step-by-step explains, okay, what can you do to find the right initiatives to invest in? What things do you need to take into consideration to decide if you want to move ahead? There's a wonderful landscape initiatives map co-developed between TFA and CDP with, well, I don't know actually how many, but well over 100, maybe even over 200 different landscape initiatives that are out there that might be relevant for you to know about. Case studies, there's a recurring newsletter that provides information. This webinar, but also previous webinar recordings can be found on this website. So I think it's an amazing place to start, but also to come back to, and that's also what we hear from company partners, that they come back to this platform again and again, for example, also to inform new colleagues about what the landscape approach is, what the right terms are, and how this actually works. Next slide, please. So the next source or resource that I wanted to highlight is ISEAL Alliance, maybe well known to you for their work in supply chain and verification mechanisms, but they actually also have a wonderful team very much focused on sustainable landscapes and jurisdictions, and they do great work, particularly also for what we call the landscape community. So all the practitioners, organizations that are highly active in, for example, implementing landscape initiatives. But I think this is also a great resource for companies, particularly when I think you're a bit further ahead, you have a good grasp of what a landscape initiative is, but you really need to get some, the definition of what a landscape initiative is, because you want to communicate this correctly to inside or outside your company, and you want to get the best practice guidance of how to engage, for example, in landscape initiatives. So ISEAL Alliance has some great resources on their websites, and one that I would like, or two actually, that I would like to highlight is one on mature landscape initiatives. So the core criteria that Claire already introduced to you. So that was, I would say, a co-creation between ISEAL and CDP, but many more organizations chipped in there. And the second one is good guidance on how to make credible claims on your investments in landscape initiatives. And those are also truly helpful, because in the end, for any company, and that makes complete sense, there needs to be a deliverable, a result coming from your investment in these landscape initiatives. Then the third one, Jack, if you move to the third slide. is, of course, SourceUp, which is very close to my heart since I've been managing that one for a few years now. And this is a platform to delve into concrete examples of landscape initiatives, find and connect with the relevant landscape initiatives for you, and access comprehensive progress data for your supported landscape. So actually how we have positioned SourceUp is that it can be relevant already from really early on, right? When you're still exploring the idea of investing in landscape initiatives, it can be really helpful to just go through SourceUp. You can access our map, you see it on the top right, find some landscape initiatives that interest you, read about it. Okay, how does this work? What do they tell you about the setup of their program? What are the typical goals that landscape initiatives embrace? How do they report? So you get a much more concrete grasp, in addition to what you can learn on JA Resource Hub, for example, of what landscapes are. And there are now more than 60 different landscape initiatives on SourceUp positioned, and they're growing every day. But in addition to that initial information, you can also find proper reporting data on SourceUp. So these landscape initiatives include their key goals and their indicators, as well as progress data in SourceUp, which is publicly available, so you can get access to that when you navigate to SourceUp. It can be helpful to create an account to also get the most details, but most of the data is immediately available if you navigate to SourceUp, and that can help you once you have decided to invest in a landscape initiative. So also later on in your journey with landscape initiatives, SourceUp is aimed to be a great source of help. There's many more I can share about SourceUp here, and I want to be respectful of time a little bit, but I definitely recommend that you visit SourceUp, and we really see it as something that is complementary to the great JA Resource Hub that we have now the privilege to also manage. Then last but not least, the slide on LandScale, which I think is also a wonderful resource for companies. It provides independent landscape assessments based on a very comprehensive methodology, and they have a great M&E platform that can be very supportive for landscape initiatives to strengthen their data collection, the structure of that, and improve and strengthen the credibility of the results coming out of those landscape initiatives. Now, of course, that's mainly work that landscape initiatives and their teams do with LandScale, but why I think this is also an incredible resource for companies is, first of all, once you're in that process of engaging in landscape initiatives, you want to understand what are common and good key performance indicators. You know, what is the framework that I can use to look at landscape initiatives and understand what priorities can and should be. I think that framework is really interesting, and you can find it on their website. Also on their website are, I think, well over 30 landscape initiatives now that have been assessed, have had a baseline assessment, and that could also be of interest for you to invest in. As also shared, they have a great M&E tool that might be interesting if you're investing in a landscape initiative and you see that, for example, the monitoring and evaluation is an element that could require further strengthening, then LandScale might be an option. And then last but not least, there are, of course, many companies that at some point require some sort of validation of results from any of their sustainability investments, and then LandScale, I would say, is the go-to mechanism to do that for their landscapes. Last slide, please. So I want to wrap things up, and I think this very much is the same message that Joe brought, right? It can be, in some cases, a really good reason to go by yourself, right? Do a project or do that maybe with one or two partners in your supply chain. But if you want to go far, if you want to really address the systemic approaches, if you want to create resilient supply chains and therefore also resilient supply sheds, the landscape initiative and the landscape approach is a great methodology and approach to do that. But on top of that, and that was kind of the double reason that I added this proverb on this slide, was you also don't have to go on the journey alone when engaging in landscape initiatives. There are partners out there, right? It's great. We look forward to also engaging. If you have questions, please reach out to any of the people here in the webinar, but also use the tools that I just shared with you. So I really recommend that you just take your first step and get in touch. And I'm convinced that it will bring a lot to your company, and probably more than you can estimate right now. Back to you, Felipe. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That's fantastic. A winding road for which we need to take a journey, and you know, you basically shared a call for action, a call for collective action. As you mentioned, you can tap into partnerships. Maybe I know, Joe, you have to leave early, but just a quick question to you before you go. How does companies such as yours, commit to have an impact through investment, directed investment into the landscape, beyond looking into, the normal implementing partners, would be NGOs and so forth? How do you factor in where you don't have this capacity in place, and look for other alliances with, governments, local governments, etc.? Can you share some light on that?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And I think that's why the landscape maturity approach set out by Claire and kind of there also in SourceUp is so important, because actually when we invest in a landscape initiative, we are actually looking for that alignment across government, across NGOs, across communities, and for that kind of multi-stakeholder approach to be we see that as absolutely essential to delivering a successful landscape initiative. In fact, I would say that it's very hard to deliver the outcomes or good long-lasting outcomes with landscape initiative without having that in place. So while we are quite high up the supply chain, so it's quite hard for us to deal with kind of like producing governments on the ground and communities on the ground in a way because of that kind of lack of direct connection. And nor do I actually think that necessarily like someone like myself is the best person to actually have talking to a Brazilian farmer, for example. Our kind of worlds are quite different, and I would just come across as kind of ignorant and possibly irritating. And so I think that's why it's really important we work with, when our implementing party sets out a landscape initiative, that multi-stakeholder approach is a foundational brick, basically, for whatever we do next. And so hopefully that kind of builds that kind of that unlocks the impact that we all require in that landscape. Does that answer the question?
It does, and it demonstrates that there's not a simple, approach, but that through that partnership approach, you can find the tools, the conduits to solve the issue and make sure it becomes you want to be effective in your investment. You want to make sure that you have it right. So it does that. And maybe another question for you, Joe, but I know you have to leave, so I will allow you to just answer that in 1 minute and then even just disappear. But we, through our platform, are happy to capture more input from the audience and make sure that in the ongoing process of Jan and SourceUp, we can address this. SBTI targets. What does that mean for Sainsbury in terms of categorization of landscape initiatives, linking this to BVCM? What can you share on that, and how can you pair this out with the landscape investments that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think that we do have SBTI targets. Do landscape initiatives play a role in delivering those SBTI targets? Not at the moment, is the straight answer. We don't want that to be the case, but we need traceability improvements in supply chains in order to basically link those landscape initiatives into our supply chain so we can show insetting. We hope those traceability improvements will come about partly through the implementation of the EU deforestation regulation, and that can open up a conversation with our suppliers, with our traders, about if these landscapes are actually in our supply chain, and therefore can we start to kind of articulate benefits in terms of carbon from them. We're working on kind of pilot projects with the landscape initiative to see if that's possible. All I can say is watch this space. But even so, like, I think the case that that you can't just invest in your farmer, your farms, that you need to be investing at a resilient farm doesn't exist, a resilient landscape exists, right? And so you need to be thinking at that kind of more holistic level, which is where I go back to my original point about the education of your internal teams, your C teams is so important. Helping them to understand that is absolutely critical to the kind of successful investment and really business buy into this project. I'm really sorry, I do have to go, but it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Joe. Yes, Joe was referring to not only, collective action, but collective force, right? How we team up to make sure that those instruments that are out there can be deployed effectively. SBTI has represented an important benchmark in terms of the aspirational work of companies, and we have now in many ways and forms a challenge to make sure that this gets deployed effectively on the ground. And for that, the collective force, as efforts like the Forest Positive Coalition of Action are leading, represent an opportunity to do that. But that brings us back to this issue about the infrastructure that exists, right? And so let me go back to you, Claire. 95% of the jurisdictional action efforts are focused on environmental goals. But beside reputational benefits that come about, from your analysis, your experience, your perspectives, what are the main drivers for companies to invest in landscapes? We're talking about business models all around, right? So how do these get mainstreamed, and how do we look at this when 45% of the investment is related to production and supply chains themselves? So over to you on this, Claire.
Thanks. Yes, this is the kind of age-old question, right, of the business case, and we're still always trying to chase down the answers to this. I think it's very fair to say that we collectively as a community working in this space are always still really trying to make explicit the examples and the data to reinforce the case for supporting landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, and also for understanding those drivers and the investment. I would say that just to kind of clarify the nuance in that is that we see that disclosure says that the primary goals that the disclosing company is seeking to achieve is environmental. Due to the fact that they can report multiple, it could also be that in that same landscape initiative that they're also supporting production goals. So it's not to say it's one or the other, but just to kind of give some thinking behind that as well. As I mentioned earlier, we are still in the analysis stage of the specificities of that disclosure, and we anticipate that around 50% of the engagements disclosed will check out as being credible, mature landscape initiatives. The others could be on their journey there or could be another type of intervention. So I think this data also suggests that what we're seeing is that there is potentially still engagement in the space of more kind of CSR activity or peripheral programs. And those that are identifying the sourcing production goals are probably more likely associated with the mature landscapes where that is an integral part of their landscape's wider goal. So what we'll be seeking to do when we're making this data available to our partners in this space and to the wider world is to kind of really try to advocate for the use of this data and understanding to advocate for companies embedding landscape action into core business strategies. Instead of treating landscape initiatives as those more peripheral programs, but to really say this is the pathway you could be on to supporting a more mature initiative, integrating it into sourcing, procurement policies, etc., and looking at those criteria that are emerging from the data to do all of what kind of Joe outlined, really about like enabling sustainability professionals to take that business case internally to make the case for support from the company. That's where we're really trying to take this analysis to enable those conversations to be had and those business cases to be made publicly available, and those pathways to seeing the route to return on investment, etc., as we're seeing them emerge through disclosure and through the reports and evidence produced through the landscapes themselves directly.
Thank you. That's extremely useful. I would like to ask Anela, as we hear Claire, she's trying to think on how we get it right in terms of, the mobilization of corporate action into the ground and the framing that jurisdictional and landscape approaches bring to the fore. But, even if we have this infrastructure, we have this corporate wheel, the world has a bigger setting that's changing by the day. And we've seen in this space of soft commodity trade, the emergence of a set of regulatory parameters that create a lot of noise. It could be a fantastic opportunity to double down on addressing this issue, but it could lead us also to paralysis through analysis, right? How we can do it the other way around, how we can use all this infrastructure, this corporate wheel, and what you were referring to, Anne, a lot, the deployment of collective action to really make the most out of it. So, when you look into voluntary standards and how they interface with chain of custody certification schemes at the jurisdictional and landscape level for enhancing deforestation and conversion-free sourcing, how do we enhance this in this complex setting that we're going about? How that instruments such as LandScale, SourceUp, how these instruments can be the way forward to unlock and create the enabling conditions so that we can cope with whatever the market demands.
Oof, good question, Felipe. So this really relates to how can you create a good match between the requirements for companies, whether they are voluntary or legal requirements, and what data you can get out of landscape initiatives that you invest in. So this is something that is, I think, very important for companies that decide to invest in landscape initiatives to really think through well from the start. And obviously, yes, there's a lot of legislation out there that is currently not clear where it's heading or how quick things will change. So it is challenging to pin down at the moment, but really to have this very clear conversation with your landscape initiatives. Okay, I'm reporting into CDP. I'm doing SBTI. I aim to do SBTN. I'm European based, so I will report under CSRD. These are all elements that landscape initiatives might be able to support, but they need to know that and understand that that's a priority for you as a company so they can incorporate that into their M&E systems. And I would definitely also want to call out to the companies to also consider not just investing in implementation projects that are part of the landscape initiatives, but also really strengthen the landscape initiative as a whole, and particularly the monitoring and reporting part, but also the governance part of landscape initiatives requires some investment, and that is something that companies can help with, by the way, not just with investment, but also with their time and attention and with clear communication about that.
Fantastic. I have a final question, which I'm going to pose for both of you. I think both of you can share different perspectives. This question is related to, how do you prioritize where to invest in which landscapes? And I think, Claire, you can come from the angle of, business models, business decisions. How do this get factored in? And Analog from your end is the other way around. It's like the technological, methodological elements that need to be factored in. So if you could shed some light in this perspective of prioritization, that would be useful.
Yeah, thank you. It's a challenging question to answer, given it could be so variable, obviously, across, kind of different companies with different sourcing footprints, etc. But let me try to give a little bit of thought to how we kind of might approach this theoretically. So something that's a kind of very active and live conversation internally to CDP at the moment is around nature transition plans, and thinking about those in relation to things like the TNFD, science-based targets for nature, for land, oceans, water, etc. We're looking to a future where we might see a world where a company needs to look at its priority locations and then needs to start to identify what types of actions to take in those locations. So I think thinking through that lens first of once the company has determined its priority locations, then it's the kind of determination of what type of goal or action they need to take there and at what scale. And I think when we're getting to the point where there's a recognition of the scale being significant, So it could be related to, again, a multitude of goals, the scale of the forests at risk or the forest frontier, related to the size of the watershed, etc. But if we're essentially coming to a conclusion that it is a sufficiently significant scale to suggest the need for a landscape initiative or jurisdictional initiative, then we'd say, look at what's already out there, of course, because whilst we would very much like to see a world where we see kind of pioneering companies out there looking to support landscape initiatives from the ground up, it doesn't necessarily need to be that they take that role independently, right? Like, we know that there's a world of practitioners out there. We know that there's a lot of emerging initiatives, or let's say early stage initiatives, who could really benefit from support. And what we've tried to do with the map that Annalot mentioned earlier, that we created a couple of years ago, is to start to really make available to the wider world which initiatives are already there. And then, hopefully, as we iterate that over time, we can start to have greater clarity about the types of goals they need supported. This is, again, information that you can already access through SourceUp and LandScale for their initiatives. But, going forward, we'd like to see that for the several hundreds of initiatives that we've had disclosed, so that it's essentially kind of a company identifies where they want to operate, and then they can connect that with what's maybe already there that they could connect to and support. So yeah, we'd really like to kind of see that we can continue to make, again, that information available to inform that type of decision making in companies to support that process.
Okay, happy to maybe follow up directly on that, but also looking at the time. So if I would be asked this question by a company, right, where to direct my investment, and which landscape initiative to choose, I would say, okay, start with your commodity base. Which are your priority commodities? Then look at your risk. So a risk-based or a due diligence-based approach. So, and I would look at both elements, right? So both from where is my biggest impact, or where am I potentially impacting negatively the environment, social elements that I need to address, that are important to achieve my strategy, and particularly my sustainability strategy. But then also the other way around, which are key sourcing areas for my company for the longer term future that are important for us, that they are resilient to maintain our supply, to maintain our profitability. I would say definitely that is the sweet spot to look for landscape initiatives. And I'd like to add one more thing, right? There are, of course, major regions where landscape initiatives may not make sense because there are very strong governments or other local institutions that have cover risks or address risks present. So, for example, usually landscape initiatives make a lot of sense in emerging economies where there are many smallholder farmers active, and there's a large threat, for example, on environmental resources in that region. But with that caveat, I think look at your risks, maybe a last one, also look at your leverage, right? Where am I taking a large share of my volume, but where am I as a company also relevant for a region? So I'm a relevant conversation partners for those regions to work on, systemically on sustainability. So that would be my feedback. And maybe one more thing that I wanted to add, because I saw one of those questions in the chat. We see many landscape initiatives where much more than one company invest, right? So it can often be a coalition of companies. This can be a great way of also collaborating with other companies that might be your supplier, your customer, but also your competitor. And often then also donors step in, which is also a big advantage of many landscape initiatives, as well as local governments, right? Where they are a partner and see that partnership of companies, and then also support those governments or those donors to co-invest in any initiative to support that landscape. Back over to you, Felipe.
Thank you, and thanks to you a lot, Claire, for great presentations, and not only that, great insight, and for Joe as well, and for the audience for great questions that were brought to the fore. And for the team behind this webinar, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. You just close with that message. And in that spirit, the Jurisdictional Action Network gets paired out with SourceUp. SourceUp is going to be managing this. We're trying to create a shared vision between the SourceUp and TFA teams to sustain and grow this community. Remember that the Jurisdictional Action Network brings about 2,400 proponents of solutions. This is part of how we enhance that capacity that Claire mentioned. And we want to invite everyone to join, to get closer, to get engaged, to find that community for information flows and knowledge that allows us to deploy these strategies in the best way possible, maximize the business value proposition that Claire explained. It's collective action on the making. That's the purpose. And with this, I want to close the webinar, thanking everyone and encouraging everyone to keep moving forward this needle. Thanks a lot.